Why life was brutal for the ancient Maya, a calm, dry, and quietly haunting bedtime history monologue. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back, far back, to the jungles of Central America, to a world of stone temples rising above green canopies, of humid air thick with the sound of cicadas, and of people who built one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever forgotten. The Maya. They left behind cities of carved limestone, calendars that counted eternity, and stories written in glyphs so elegant they look like dreams turned into mathematics. And yet, for all their genius, their daily lives were brutal, short, and soaked in both sweat and blood. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe take a slow breath, because tonight, we're wandering through the ancient Maya world. Its brilliance, its misery, and the strange, delicate beauty of a civilization that believed even suffering could please the gods. The Maya world stretched across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It was never one single empire, more like 1,000 city-states, each run by its own divine king, all pretending not to be jealous of one another.
Ensure the colors are vibrant.
The first thing you'd notice, if you found yourself there 2,000 years ago, is how alive everything felt. The jungle never stopped moving. Trees leaned over stone causeways, monkeys screamed from the treetops, and bright green parrots sliced the air like thrown jewels. It was beautiful and exhausting. The humidity could flatten even the proudest conqueror. The Maya built cities in the middle of that heat. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul. Places that rose like islands of geometry from seas of vegetation.
And it is yours.
Tall step pyramids, palaces with carved facades, courtyards where nobles once played, games with rubber balls and divine dignity. But those grand plazas hid a harsher truth behind. Every shining temple was 1,000 huts of thatch and mud. For every priest who gazed at the stars, there were hundreds of farmers bending under the sun. And for every king who was worshipped like a god, there were slaves who hauled limestone until their hands bled. It wasn't paradise. It was a delicate bargain with nature. And nature, as always, had the better lawyers. Most Maya people were farmers. They grew maize, corn, along with beans, squash, and chili peppers. It sounds wholesome, almost idyllic, until you remember that the soil in the rainforest isn't particularly fond of human ambition. It's thin, fragile, and easily exhausted. So, farmers practiced slash and burn agriculture.
Look, I can see the whole
They'd
field
clear
from
a
here.
patch of forest, plant their
mine.
crops,
I found the
harvest
warrior.
for a few years,
Look,
and then
I can
move
see the whole
on when
field
the
from here.
earth gave up. It worked, but it left little room for error. A bad harvest meant hunger. 2 bad harvests meant famine. And famine meant the gods were angry. Which was inconvenient, because the gods were always angry. A farmer's day began before sunrise. You woke to the sound of insects and the weight of humidity. Walked barefoot to your fields, and started swinging a stone blade before the mist had even lifted. You wore a simple loincloth. Maybe, if you were lucky, a cotton tunic. Shoes were optional, mostly because they didn't last long. The sun climbed higher. The air thickened. You kept working, because stopping wasn't a choice. When you ate, it was maize tortillas, beans, and maybe a bit of chili for flavor. Meat was rare, mostly for festivals or sacrifices. If you were noble, you got turkey or venison. If you were poor, you got corn, again, and the faint hope that someone in your family might someday be reincarnated as a noble. By nightfall, your back ached, your stomach buzzed with hunger, and the jungle hummed around you like a lullaby that never let you rest. The Maya were obsessed with time, not just with days or seasons, with cycles upon cycles, layers of meaning woven into the very rhythm of existence. They had more calendars than anyone could reasonably need. 1 for the solar year, another for the sacred ritual cycle, and then a third, the long count, that measured time from the creation of the world. It wasn't just bureaucracy. To the Maya, time itself was alive, a force that had to be fed, appeased, and honored. Every ceremony, every offering, every drop of blood was a conversation with eternity. There were no Turfrauen. Kings claimed to control those cycles. Each ruler was both monarch and shaman. On the human face of cosmic order, he performed rituals to keep the sun rising, the rain falling, and the universe functioning. When things went wrong, when crops failed, or enemies attacked, it was his fault, and his way to fix it was usually the same: more blood. Let's drift now to one of those royal courts. It's early morning in Palanque. Mist clings to the temples. The air smells of burning copal incense. Inside a carved stone palace, the king, wearing a headdress taller than most men, sits upon a throne shaped like a jaguar. His name might be Pakal, or Yaxkukmo, or any of the grand names that sound like thunder rolling through leaves. He is young, divine, and perpetually concerned that his neighbors are plotting something. Around him, scribes sit cross-legged, painting glyphs on bark paper codices. Servants bring cacao, the chocolate drink of royalty, foamed with chili and honey. A priest chants in the background, counting days on a calendar made of jade discs, and outside, a line of captives kneels in the courtyard. Their faces are painted blue, the color of sacrifice. They've been bound, perfumed, and prepared to meet the gods. The king will soon pierce his skin, maybe his tongue, maybe his genitals, and let his blood drip onto paper. The paper will be burned. The smoke will rise, and he will see visions. The gods will whisper approval. And somewhere, a farmer will die of exhaustion thinking it was all part of the plan. Maya religion was not built for comfort. It was built for balance. and balance required pain. Blood was the currency of creation. The gods had bled to make the world, and humanity was expected to return the favor. The simplest form of offering was self-sacrifice. Men and women pierced their tongues, ears, and flesh with obsidian blades or stingray spines. The more noble you were, the more enthusiastically you were expected to bleed. Then came the larger gifts. Captured warriors, slaves, sometimes even children. Their hearts were offered to the gods atop the pyramid steps. Quick, efficient, ritualized. It wasn't cruelty, at least not in their eyes. It was maintenance. The same way you might refill your car's oil, they refilled the sun's energy. We find it gruesome now. They found it responsible. For all their spirituality, the Maya were also relentlessly political. Each city-state was a kingdom, with alliances, rivalries, and betrayals that would have made a soap opera blush. Wars were constant, though rarely about territory. They were about prestige. Capturing an enemy king or noble was the highest honor. Killing him was wasteful. Sacrificing him was divine theater. Battles were fought with spears, obsidian blades, and wooden clubs in thick jungle heat. Armor was minimal, cotton padding soaked in salt water, effective enough to stop arrows, but not dehydration. After the fight came the pageantry. The victors would parade their captives through the streets, display their trophies, sometimes literal heads, and dedicate monuments carved with smugness. Each stela, each stone column, was a press release in hieroglyphic form. We won again. Our gods love us more. It was a civilization that glorified endurance. To live was to suffer gracefully. To die was to do so meaningfully. But even civilizations have breaking points. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the classic Maya world began to crumble. The reasons, like most collapses, were complicated. Droughts, over-farming, warfare, politics, hubris, probably all of the above. The cities that had once shone with white limestone began to darken with vines. Trade routes failed. Crops withered. Kings performed more and more sacrifices, as if bleeding faster might impress the weather. People fled. Villages emptied. The jungle crept back, inch by inch, reclaiming what had always been hers. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, once centers of cosmic order, became silent. Their temples filled with birds, their plazas with roots. The Maya didn't vanish, despite the popular myth. They adapted, migrated, survived. Millions of their descendants still live today across Central America, still speaking the languages of their ancestors. But the divine kings, the astronomers, the blood priests, they were gone. The gods, it seemed, had stopped answering. Daily life for those who remained was still hard. The climate didn't forgive, and the new powers, whether Toltec, Aztec, or Spanish centuries later, weren't known for mercy. By the time European explorers stumbled into the Yucatan, Many Maya towns were already ruins covered in trees. To the Spaniards, they looked like the work of giants, which, in a way, they were. Giants of patience, calculation, and endurance. The irony is that the people who built those pyramids never thought they were building for eternity. They built to honor time, to live inside its cycles, not conquer them. They believed the world had been created and destroyed many times before, and would be again. To them, collapse wasn't tragedy. It was renewal. The forest would take back the stone. The gods would rest, and someday the cycle would begin anew. Let's pause there for a moment. Imagine the jungle now. Thick vines curl around broken stairways. Howler monkeys call from the treetops. Rain drips from leaves the size of shields. Somewhere, beneath that green silence, a carving still waits. A king's face, eroded but proud, staring out from the past like he still expects his people to return. A whiff of the past. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A world of candlelight, cold stone, and questionable decisions. Where kings wore ermine, peasants wore mud, and everyone, well, everyone probably smelled a little different than we do today. So, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. This won't be a wild ride, just a slow, meandering stroll through medieval streets, where the scent of history lingers in the air. Because tonight, we're asking a question that's haunted modern imaginations for centuries. How did medieval people actually smell? We've all seen the movies. Peasants caked in filth, nobles fainting into perfumed handkerchiefs, and everyone living in a haze of unwashed misery. But was that really true? Or have we exaggerated it, the way we exaggerate everything about the past, just to feel a little better about our own deodorant? Let's take a slow breath, though perhaps not too deep, and find out. Now, if you were dropped into a medieval town, say, London in the 1300s, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the architecture or the lack of cars. It would be the smell. Cities were, let's say, organic. There were no sewage systems as we know them. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the street. Livestock wandered freely. Pigs, chickens, the occasional goat, and the rivers, those shimmering medieval lifelines, doubled as garbage chutes. But before we start gagging at the thought, let's be fair, most people didn't actually want to live in filth. In fact, many medieval people were obsessed with cleanliness, just in ways that don't quite line up with modern expectations. They didn't have antibacterial soap or coconut-scented shampoo, but they did have routines, rituals, and more personal hygiene than we often give them credit for. Let's start with washing. If you were a reasonably respectable person in, say, 12th century France, you would have washed your hands and face daily. It wasn't optional. The church preached that cleanliness was next to godliness, though not in the wash your armpits, everyday sense we think of. Now, it was more about spiritual purity. Still, that meant washing was encouraged, especially before meals, prayers, and sleep. People washed with water infused with herbs, rosemary, lavender, mint, sometimes mixed with wine or vinegar for a touch of acidity. Soap existed, too, though it was made with animal fat and lye. Not exactly Dove's gentle on the skin formula. Most homes had a basin, a pitcher, and a towel, and public bathhouses were surprisingly common, especially in cities like Paris, London, and Cologne. In Paris alone, there were over 30 public bathhouses by the 13th century. You could go there to bathe, socialize, and occasionally engage in extracurricular activities that the church pretended not to know about. But still, people bathed, not every day, of course. That would have seemed excessive, but weekly, sometimes more, depending on your status and the local water supply, and the upper classes, they took it further. Let's drift into a royal chamber for a moment. Imagine a noble woman. In the 14th century, her bath is being prepared. A large wooden tub lined with sheets to protect her delicate skin from splinters. The water is scented with rose petals, chamomile, or maybe juniper berries. Servants bring her wine, perhaps a sweetmeat or two. This wasn't just hygiene, it was an event. The French even coined a phrase, prendre un bain à deux, to take a bath for two. You can guess how that went, but even without romance involved, bathing was considered luxurious, even moral. It cleansed the body and refreshed the soul. Of course, this depended on the time and place. Because later, particularly after the Black Death, people began to fear water itself. Doctors started saying that water opened the pores and allowed diseases to enter the body, which, admittedly, sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, everything did. So instead of bathing, they covered themselves in linen undergarments and changed those instead. The logic was that the linen absorbed the impurities from the skin. And in fairness, it kind of worked. Let's pause there for a moment, because it's one of the strangest shifts in European hygiene. Early medieval people were bathing enthusiastically, visiting bathhouses, and scrubbing themselves with herbal concoctions. Then, around the 14th century, they stopped, partly because of disease fears, partly because the church became uncomfortable with the moral risks of communal nudity. So by the 1500s, many wealthy people simply didn't wash in water. Instead, they changed their linen obsessively, sometimes twice a day, and doused themselves in perfume. Which brings us to another fascinating question. If medieval people weren't showering, how did they smell pleasant? The answer: layers. Literally and figuratively. They wore linen next to the skin. It was light, breathable, and absorbent. Then heavier fabrics over that, which rarely touched the body directly. The outer garments stayed relatively clean because the inner layers took the hit. And since laundering linen was easy, This system worked. Most of the odor stayed trapped in the underclothes, which could be washed or replaced. It wasn't perfect, but for the time, it was practical. Perfume, of course, was the next line of defense. The medieval world smelled of rosemary, lavender, sage, musk, and civet, a scent derived from the glands of small animals, which sounds horrific, but was considered irresistibly sensual. Perfume wasn't just vanity. People genuinely believed good smells repelled disease, and in a world without modern medicine, that idea made sense. A doctor walking through plague-stricken streets would carry a bouquet of herbs, or a pomander, a small metal ball filled with aromatic substances. He'd hold it to his nose as protection from the bad air, because, as far as they knew, bad smells caused illness, so people perfumed everything. Their hair, their gloves, their furniture, even their prayer books. It was believed that the nose was a gateway to health, or, failing that, at least to dignity. Now, what about the peasants? Surely they were a little less fragrant. Well, yes, but not as bad as legend suggests. Most peasants worked outdoors, near clean rivers and wells. They washed their faces and hands frequently. They may not have bathed in tubs, but they swam in streams, rinsed off after long days, and used coarse cloths to scrub away dirt. Their clothes were simple, their diets relatively clean, and their labor kept them naturally ventilated. So while they may not have smelled like roses, they probably didn't smell like death either. Their homes, on the other hand, were another matter. Smoke, manure, and cooking odors mingled into what we might politely call a strong bouquet. But even there, medieval people did their best. They burned herbs indoors. They scattered rushes or sweet-smelling flowers across floors to mask unpleasant scents. And on feast days, they cleaned everything, because nothing says holy celebration like scrubbing your dirt floor until it sparkles slightly less than before. Let's drift now into the later Middle Ages, that awkward period between medieval grime and early modern vanity. By the 16th century, bathing had fallen out of fashion, but cleanliness hadn't disappeared. It just evolved. Instead of washing with water, nobles would wipe themselves with cloths dipped in wine or vinegar. They'd sprinkle scented powders into their hair, and they used toothpicks and cloths to clean their teeth, which, surprisingly, were often in better shape than ours. Thanks to the lack of refined sugar, Queen Elizabeth I, for instance, was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. A charmingly low bar. But she also owned dozens of perfumes and took great care with her linens. By the standards of her time, she was immaculate, and beneath the surface, the old habits of washing never entirely disappeared. Ordinary people still visited rivers, still boiled water for washing babies and invalids, still clung to the idea that clean hands were a mark of decency. So maybe the Middle Ages weren't a cesspool after all, just a little musky. If you were to step back into a medieval village now, the smells would be powerful, yes, but not alien. You'd smell smoke, bread baking, animals, people, herbs, all manure and sweat, all coexisting in a strange, earthy harmony. It wouldn't smell good, but it wouldn't be unnatural either. It would smell like life, unfiltered, unsanitized, and utterly human. And perhaps that's the best answer to our question. How did medieval people actually smell? They smelled like themselves, like the world they lived in, full of effort, imperfection, and the best intentions, steeped in rosemary and regret. Let's drift now, a little deeper, into the quieter corners of that machinery. In Part 2, we'll explore what really went on behind those palace doors, how eunuchs managed royal women, manipulated emperors, and created entire shadow governments of their own. The white eunuchs, often from the Balkans, handled the administrative side of palace life. Finances, correspondence, education. Together, they formed a strange dual government inside the palace, one that dealt not in armies or taxes, but in secrets and silences. Imagine it, the Sultan, nominally all-powerful, yet surrounded entirely by people who couldn't have families, whose loyalty depended solely on how well they could navigate invisible politics. It's a setup that sounds like it should collapse. And yet, somehow, it didn't. For centuries, it functioned with eerie stability, the quiet power of the castrated courtier. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when the most powerful men in the world weren't quite men anymore, when the word loyalty meant a little less about politics and a little more about the surgical removal of certain incentives. Yes, tonight we're talking about the eunuchs who ran empires. It's an odd corner of history. One of those topics everyone knows existed, but nobody really likes to think about for too long. Probably for obvious reasons. But for nearly 2,000 years, if you peeked behind the silk curtains of royal palaces in China, Byzantium, Persia, or even the Ottoman world, you'd almost always find one constant. A quiet, sharp-eyed man in immaculate robes, whispering into the emperor's ear. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't even allowed to have children, but somehow he had more power than anyone else in the room. So, tonight as you settle in, dim the lights. And forget about whatever indignities your own boss put you through this week. Let's drift through a few centuries of men who had the strangest jobs imaginable, and yet somehow ran half the world. The origins of a peculiar profession. The idea of the eunuch is ancient, older than Christianity, older than Islam, and probably older than written law itself. The concept seems to have appeared everywhere, from ancient Mesopotamia to China almost simultaneously, which says a lot about humanity's shared creativity in finding new and horrifying ways to maintain control. The logic behind it was, in its own way, elegant. If you want a servant who won't be distracted by lust, family, or ambition, well, you can just remove the temptation. The earliest known eunuchs served in royal harems around 2000 BCE in Sumer and Akkad. Their role was, at first, purely practical. Guard the women without any risk of producing awkward royal half-brothers. But it didn't take long before kings realized, if you've got someone who can be trusted around your wives, you can probably trust him around your paperwork too. So, gradually, eunuchs started climbing out of the harem and into the bureaucracy. In Assyria, they managed royal correspondence and provincial taxes. In Persia, they guarded the king's personal seal, which, in an absolute monarchy, is roughly the same as controlling every decision in the empire. By the time of the Achaemenid Empire, eunuchs were everywhere. The Greek historian Herodotus, who had strong opinions about everyone, described them as the keepers of the king's secrets, which, to be fair, sounds like both a prestigious job and a nightmare LinkedIn headline. China. The empire of eunuchs, of course. No civilization elevated eunuchs quite like imperial China. Chinese emperors had an almost artistic commitment to the practice. Over the course of more than 2 millennia, they employed tens of thousands of eunuchs, sometimes entire bureaucratic branches made up solely of them. By the Ming Dynasty, there were as many as 70,000 eunuchs working in the Forbidden City, which is roughly the population of a small modern town, if every resident had lost their reproductive rights in service of an emperor. At first, the system made a kind of sense. The Chinese court was obsessed with the idea of purity, not in the moral sense, but in the political one. Family ties were dangerous. Every nobleman had relatives who could scheme, bribe, and intermarry their way into rebellion. Eunuchs, on the other hand, couldn't pass their wealth to heirs, couldn't build dynasties, and supposedly had nothing to fight for except the emperor's favor, which worked fine until, inevitably, the eunuchs became their own dynasty in everything but name. The strange case of Zheng He, perhaps the most famous eunuch in Chinese history, and maybe the only one to have statues erected in his honor, was Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty admiral who led China's massive treasure fleets in the early 15th century. You might have heard of him, a 7-foot-tall mariner from Yunnan who commanded ships longer than football fields, sailing from Southeast Asia to the coast of Africa, decades before Columbus got lost in the Caribbean. And yes, he did all that after being castrated at age 11. Zheng He's early life was grim, even by 14th century standards. Born to a Muslim family, captured during a rebellion, and marched off to the capital, he was selected for palace service. which was the polite euphemism for having his body permanently adjusted in favor of loyalty. But Zheng, who was brilliant, charismatic, and politically sharp, he rose through the ranks, became the trusted confidant of the ambitious Yongle Emperor, and was eventually handed command of the greatest naval expedition in Chinese history. Which is remarkable. When you think about it, a man with no bloodline, no noble name, and no, well, other things, became the face of Chinese imperial pride. For decades, Zheng He's fleet projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean. He brought home exotic gifts, foreign envoys, and the occasional giraffe, which the Ming court enthusiastically declared to be a mythical qilin, because no one wanted to admit they didn't know what a giraffe was. But when Zheng He died, the tides turned. The bureaucrats, who hated the eunuch's growing influence, began cutting funding for the fleets, literally and politically. The ships rotted away in harbor, and the eunuchs lost their sea power. The lesson was clear. When eunuchs get too ambitious, Confucian officials start sharpening their brushes. Power, scandal, and the imperial bedroom. The thing about eunuchs is that they always existed in a kind of political gray zone. Not noble, but not common. Not quite men, but far from powerless. They were, in effect, living tools of the emperor's will. And, like any good tool, they were only as loyal as the hand that held them. Some were genuinely devoted, like Zheng He. Others became little emperors of their own. Take Wei Zhongxian, for instance, the infamous 9,000-year-old eunuch of the late Ming dynasty. The title 10,000-year-old was reserved for the emperor, so Wei modestly settled for 9. He began as a gambler and a petty servant, but through flattery, ruthless efficiency, and an intimate friendship with the emperor's nursemaid, always useful, he clawed his way into absolute control of the court. Wei purged officials, restructured ministries, and even had temples built in his honor. His name was whispered like a curse throughout China. And then, as all court favorites eventually do, he fell. When the emperor died, Wei found himself without protection, and, in true Ming fashion, chose to hang himself before anyone else could get the satisfaction. His body was later exhumed and mutilated, because even in death, Ming politics refused to relax. The Byzantine variant now, while China perfected the bureaucratic eunuch, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, perfected the political one. In Constantinople, eunuchs were the ultimate insiders. The Byzantine palace was a labyrinth of intrigue, and the emperor's household was both his family and his government. Eunuchs occupied every key position. Chamberlains, treasurers, generals, even patriarchs of the church, and they weren't all victims. Some of them played the game so well they became kingmakers. Take Staurakios, a 9th-century eunuch who basically ran the empire under Emperor Nicephorus Tharnv, or Basil Lecapenus, who held power for decades, manipulating weak emperors from behind the throne. It's easy to forget that in Byzantine politics, emasculated did not mean ineffective. In fact, eunuchs were often preferred for delicate posts, precisely because they couldn't found rival dynasties. It's a theme that repeats endlessly. If a ruler feared everyone around him, the eunuch was the one person he could at least pretend to trust. Daily life behind the silk screens. But what was everyday life like for these men? Not everyone was Jung-He or Basil Lecapenus. Most eunuchs lived and died inside palace walls, never seeing daylight beyond the courtyards. They slept in communal quarters, wore distinctive robes, and were ranked by seniority in strictly regulated hierarchies. The higher-ranking ones could be incredibly wealthy, owning estates, art, and even adopting heirs through fictive sons. A legal loophole that suggests human ingenuity always finds a way to cheat the system. They formed secret networks, sponsored poets and painters, and occasionally feuded with scholars or soldiers. Many devoted themselves to their duties so completely that, in their writings, you can still hear the hollow ache of people who had nowhere else to belong. Some left memoirs, quiet, bureaucratic documents filled with tiny notes about palace life, how the emperor took his tea, which court ladies favored which perfumes, which generals were secretly plotting, and between the lines, you can sense an awareness that they were both indispensable and expendable at the same time. The Ottoman connection. Let's drift west, for a moment, to the Ottoman Empire, perhaps the last great civilization to institutionalize eunuchs on a grand scale. The Ottoman court was famously divided between black eunuchs and white eunuchs, an arrangement that could only have been dreamed up by a bureaucracy with too much time on its hands. The black eunuchs, mostly from East Africa, managed the imperial harem, the secluded world of the sultan's wives, concubines and daughters. Their leader, the chief black eunuch, was one of the most powerful men in the empire, responsible for both protecting and policing the women who carried the future of the dynasty. Perfumed fortunes. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back into a softer, stranger corner of history, one that smells faintly of rosewater, candle wax, and scandal, because tonight's story isn't about queens or empresses. It's about the women who lived like them, without the titles, the courtesans, the mistresses, the women who built fortunes and empires of influence in the bedrooms of kings, dukes and gentlemen, who probably should have been paying more attention to their actual wives. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Pour something decadent, or at least warm. And let's drift through the story of the richest prostitutes in history. Now, prostitute is a blunt word, and in truth, the women we'll meet tonight existed on a scale. From common street workers to dazzling courtesans who dined with cardinals and corrected the French king's grammar. They weren't all tragic, and they weren't all triumphant, but they were all, in their own way, experts in survival, using wit, beauty, and occasionally a strategic fainting spell to turn a world that hated them into one that paid for their company. And naturally, the higher they climbed, the worse it all ended. Let's start in Renaissance Venice. The shimmering city of masks, mirrors, and moral flexibility. By the 1500s, Venice was already famous for two things: trade and sin. It was a city that understood profit in all its forms. Ships came in loaded with silk and spices. Gondolas glided through canals, and behind shuttered windows, another kind of commerce was thriving. The Venetian courtesans were legends. They weren't just prostitutes. They were entertainers, poets, and philosophers of pleasure. They read Latin, played instruments, and discussed Plato between flirtations. And none was more famous than Veronica Franco. Veronica was born in 1546 to a family of modest means, which is a polite historical way of saying her father was a tradesman, and her mother helped her into the family business of courtesanship. Because, yes, there were dynasties of courtesans. Venice even had official categories. There were the meretrici, the street workers, and the courtigian honeste, the honest courtesans, which sounds like an oxymoron, but meant something closer to respectable, cultured, and extraordinarily expensive. Veronica was firmly in the second category. She entertained senators and philosophers, wrote poetry, and hosted literary salons. Her letters are full of sharp humor and weary pragmatism. At one point, she wrote, "Those who think women are easy prey should remember that lions also wear fur." Naturally, the moral authorities hated her. But she was protected, for a while, by the same men who condemned her in public. She became rich enough to own a house, commission portraits, and publish a book, something almost no woman in her position had done before. Her fame was so great that when Henry III of France visited Venice in 1574, Veronica Franco was selected to entertain him, which, in the diplomatic sense of the time, meant exactly what you think. Henry described her as brilliant. Her peers called her dangerous, and she called herself tired, because, in the end, even luxury has a cost. As Venice turned more pious, her patrons fell away. The Inquisition accused her of witchcraft, because that was the 16th century equivalent of a bad Yelp review. She lost her wealth, her home, and died in relative poverty. But her legend didn't fade. Even centuries later, writers spoke of her as the woman who turned lust into literature. And if that isn't a kind of immortality, I'm not sure what is. Let's drift north, now to France. Because if Venice perfected the courtesan, France industrialized her. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Paris had turned seduction into an economy. There were brothels for every class, from the muddy alleys of the Marais to the silk-curtained apartments near Versailles. And in this perfumed chaos, some women rose so high that kings themselves bowed, or at least reclined, before them. Let's meet Madame de Pompadour. Now, to be fair, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, her real name, wasn't exactly a prostitute, but she was a commoner who became the official mistress of King Louis XV, and in many ways she played the same game, only with finer wallpaper. Jeanne was born in 1721, and from the beginning, her mother was determined to make her exceptional. She was educated like a nobleman, taught literature, art, and the art of charm. When a fortune-teller once told her mother she'd captivate the heart of a king, she took it as career advice, and somehow she did it. At 23, Jeanne caught Louis XV's eye during a masked ball. Because, of course, it was a masked ball, and within months, she was installed at Versailles as the maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress. But Jeanne was clever. She knew that beauty fades, but influence doesn't have to. She became the king's confidant, his political advisor, and his decorator. Literally. She designed much of the Rococo aesthetic that still defines 18th century France. Soft pastels, floral motifs, and furniture so ornate it looked allergic to practicality. Under her direction, Paris flourished as a cultural capital. She patronized artists, writers, and scientists. She commissioned paintings of herself dressed as Diana the Huntress, which was bold, considering she mostly hunted power, and she was rich. Her jewelry collection alone could fund a minor war. Her estates were vast. Her gowns required their own staff, and she received an annual allowance large enough to make modern billionaires blink. But what's fascinating is that she managed it all without scandal. Mostly. She and Louis XV eventually ceased being lovers, but she remained his closest companion until her death in 1764. Even the king wept, or perhaps sneezed. The sources disagree. And when she died, her enemies in court said she was going to hell for her sins. To which one of her friends reportedly replied, "If she's gone to hell, at least it will be well decorated." Now, if Pompadour represented the elegance of sex as power, her successor represented the opposite, chaos as art form. Meet Madame du Barry. She was the spiritual sequel to Pompadour, but less polished and much more entertaining. Born Jeanne Bécu, she began life as the illegitimate daughter of a poor seamstress. By her teens, she was already dazzling Paris with her looks, and eventually found her way to a brothel that specialized in high-end clients. From there, she caught the eye of a man who groomed her for presentation at court, literally creating a fake marriage to give her noble status. And it worked. Within months, She was the new favorite of Louis XV, now an aging king who enjoyed her youthful chaos. Madame du Barry wasn't refined like Pompadour. She didn't quote Voltaire. She didn't pretend to. She just laughed, sparkled, and spent. She was covered in diamonds. She bathed in milk. She commissioned dresses so heavy they required assistance just to walk across a room. And while courtiers sneered, she smiled, because she knew they'd all trade places with her in a heartbeat. Her reign, however, was short. When Louis XV died, she was banished from court, stripped of her jewels, and sent to a convent. It didn't last. She later returned to society, wealth restored, charm intact. But the French Revolution eventually caught up with her. She was executed in 1793, reportedly begging the executioner not to make a mess of her hair, which, frankly, is the most on-brand thing she could have said. Let's drift a little further back again to Rome. Because ancient Rome, unsurprisingly, had its own share of high-class courtesans, known as meretrices or scorta, and among them one name stands out, Volumnia Cytheris. She was a freed slave, educated and trained as an entertainer. Her patrons included some of the most powerful men of her time, including Mark Antony himself. She traveled with him publicly, scandalizing polite society, and even performed in his theatrical productions. For a brief moment, she was the most famous woman in Rome, admired, condemned, and imitated. But Rome was never kind to women who refused to know their place. When Antony turned to Cleopatra, Cytheris faded into obscurity. Still, her name survived, a testament to the uneasy fascination the Romans had with women who could both enchant and embarrass their betters. As the centuries drifted on, this pattern repeated everywhere. The Georgian era had its courtesans, women like Grace Dalrymple Elliott, who went from London salons to revolutionary Paris, charming dukes and diplomats along the way. The Victorian period had its demi-mondaines, such as Cora Pearl and Leigh. Paeva, women who built literal palaces from their lovers' fortunes, and by the 19th century, the art of seduction had become a science of wealth management. La Paeva, for example, started as a Polish-Jewish seamstress. By her 40s, she owned one of the most opulent mansions in Paris, its staircase carved from Algerian onyx. When people asked how she'd achieved such luxury, she said simply, "I took my chances, and their wallets." She died obscenely rich, buried in the same marble she once bathed in. If there's a theme that threads through all of these stories, it's the irony of dependence disguised as dominance. Each of these women used men's desires to escape the limits of their time, but their power always came with an expiration date. When it was such as the beauty faded or politics shifted, they were discarded. Yet, for a moment, they lived freer, richer lives than almost any woman of their age. Their wealth wasn't just in gold or pearls, it was in access. To rooms women weren't supposed to enter, to knowledge they weren't supposed to have, and to a kind of agency their societies refused to name. They weren't queens, but they lived as though they were, and history, predictably, resented them for it. The scent of the Middle Ages. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before soap was an industry, before plumbing was a human right, and before anyone could simply light a scented candle and pretend their house didn't smell like a goat. Yes, we're going back to the Middle Ages to find out, once and for all, how people actually smelled. Now, if you've ever watched a movie set in medieval Europe, you've probably noticed that everyone looks suspiciously clean. There's always some artfully dirt-smudged peasant with perfect teeth and a tousled haircut that somehow still says Hollywood grunge chic. In reality, medieval hygiene was, well, let's just say it was a sensory experience. But here's the thing. It wasn't quite the filth-ridden chaos modern people imagine either. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between disgusting and surprisingly sensible. So, tonight, as you settle into bed and the lights fade low, we'll drift gently through the medieval world, street by street, bathhouse by bathhouse, armpit by armpit, and trace how ordinary people, nobles and monks tried to stay clean, or at least smell like they were. What did clean even mean? Before we talk about bathing, let's start with something fundamental. Medieval people didn't define cleanliness the same way we do. To us, being clean means being free of dirt, odor, and bacteria. But in the Middle Ages, no one knew bacteria existed. Germ theory was about 500 years away. Cleanliness wasn't about killing invisible microbes. It was about balancing your humors. If you were too moist, you risked illness. If you were too dry, same problem. So bathing too much was considered just as risky as bathing too little. The goal wasn't hygiene, it was harmony. This helps explain why some medieval doctors advised against frequent washing. They thought water could open up the pores, letting disease seep in, which, to be fair, if you were bathing in the average medieval river, was not an entirely unreasonable concern. That said, people didn't walk around wallowing in filth. They still washed, just differently. Instead of full baths, most people focused on the visible parts: hands, face, neck, and sometimes feet. Basically, anything that might be noticed by someone else, and that, in many ways, tells you everything you need to know about medieval hygiene priorities. The medieval morning routine imagine. It's dawn in a small 13th century village. The rooster is crowing, and you're already awake because the floor above you is a cow. You splash your face with cold water from a basin, Maybe wipe your hands with a bit of rough linen, and that's your wash for the day. If you're fancy, you might even rub your teeth with a cloth soaked in wine or vinegar. Toothbrushes were centuries away, but people still cared about their mouths, mainly because bad breath was considered deeply unholy. Then came clothing, thick layers of wool and linen that trapped heat, and, unfortunately, everything else. Undergarments absorbed sweat, which was handy because they were easier to wash than outer clothes. Laundry was done, but rarely. Water was precious, soap was expensive, and rivers were often more polluted than the people standing in them. So most folk developed a kind of tolerance for both odor and each other. When everyone smells vaguely of livestock and wood smoke, you stop noticing after a while. Bathhouses. Not as rare as you think. Here's the surprise twist. Medieval. Europeans actually loved bathing. Public bathhouses were incredibly common, not just in big cities, but in towns and even villages. Some were simple wooden huts with tubs of hot water. Others were sprawling social spaces with heated floors, snacks, and questionable moral standards. By the 13th century, Paris alone had nearly 30 public bathhouses. In London, they were called stews, which tells you everything you need to know about how clean they were. But despite the occasional scandal, bathhouses weren't always dens of sin. Families went together. Merchants discussed business there. Monks used them on holy feast days. The medieval bathhouse was like a mix between a spa, a cafe, and a slightly dodgy nightclub. People soaked, ate, gossiped, and sometimes, if they were feeling especially ambitious, got married right there in the tub. Yes, bathhouse weddings. Because nothing says eternal love like the faint aroma of communal soap, herbs, and other cleaning concoctions. Speaking of soap, it did exist. Though it wasn't quite the foamy luxury we know today, early medieval soap was made from animal fat and lye, producing something closer to an abrasive brick than a bath bar. It worked, technically, but left your skin feeling as though you'd exfoliated with regret. By the later Middle Ages, soap making had become more refined. Italian and Spanish traders imported fine olive oil soap from the Islamic world, the ancestor of modern Castile soap. In wealthier homes, fragrant herbs like lavender, rosemary, or sage were added. Poorer people used whatever was available: ash, sand, or even stale urine, which, disturbingly, was considered an excellent stain remover. The Romans had done it first, and medieval Europe, always eager to borrow a bad idea, happily kept the tradition alive. As for deodorant, not really a thing, but people tried. They used pomanders, little metal orbs filled with perfumed herbs or ambergris, hung around the neck or carried in pockets. If your daily life involved horse manure, rituratin tortusai serans, candle smoke, and chamber pots, you'd probably want one too. Royal odors, perfumed power. Now, it's easy to imagine peasants being smelly. But what about kings and queens? Surely royalty had the means to smell better? Well, yes and no. Medieval royalty had access to perfumed oils, scented gloves, and elaborate bathing rituals. But even royal palaces didn't have running water or indoor plumbing. The grand halls of Europe, the ones with gilded tapestries and marble columns, were often perfumed not with rose water, but with a thick blend of sweat, incense, and roasted meat. Consider Louis XIV of France, a man who technically lived outside our medieval range, but spiritually belonged to it. He bathed rarely, preferring to douse himself in heavy perfume instead. Court doctors insisted that bathing could weaken the body, so he simply didn't. And yet, his courtiers still called him the Sun King, which, if you've ever stood next to someone who hasn't bathed in months, feels oddly appropriate. Medieval nobles took a similar approach. When you can't eliminate odor, you can always overwhelm it. They used musk, civet, and ambergris, all derived from animals, all eye-wateringly expensive, and all, ironically, quite pungent. To our noses, these scents would smell less like Chanel and more like something between a spice market and a zoo enclosure. But back then, a strong scent meant wealth. It meant you didn't work outdoors. It meant you could afford to smell deliberately weird. The Church of Eternal Body Odor, of course, not everyone saw cleanliness as a virtue. For medieval monks, bathing was a moral hazard. Many religious orders discouraged or even banned it outright. The logic was simple. Vanity was sinful, and if you smelled too good, you were clearly up to something. Some saints prided themselves on their filth. Saint Agnes, for instance, refused to bathe or change clothes, claiming her stench kept demons and men away. And it probably did. Pilgrims sometimes collected the dirt scraped from a holy person's feet as relics. A bit of blessed grime, bottled and sold, which tells us something profound about the medieval mindset. Dirt wasn't always dirty. Sometimes it was divine. Urban stench, the smell of the Middle Ages in full bloom. So far, we've talked about individual hygiene, but let's take a moment to inhale the bigger picture. Quite literally. If you could time travel to a medieval city, say London, Paris, or Florence, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the architecture, it would be the smell. Open sewers ran down the middle of streets. People dumped waste out of windows with cheerful disregard for pedestrians. Animals lived, worked, and defecated right alongside humans. In summer, the stench was legendary. Chroniclers described vapors of corruption and odors that offend heaven. One 14th century visitor to Paris claimed he could smell the city a mile away, and he wasn't exaggerating. Medieval sanitation was an ongoing negotiation between the desire not to live in filth and the inability to do much about it. Tanners, butchers, and dyers all worked with substances that produced smells powerful enough to stun a goat. And where did all that waste go? Usually, straight into the nearest river, which also happened to be the main source of drinking water. This, incidentally, is one of the main reasons beer and wine were so popular. Not because medieval people were constantly drunk, though, to be fair, many were, but because boiled or fermented drinks were safer than water. If you've ever wondered why monks brewed so much beer, that's your answer. It was less about fun, more about survival. When the Black Death arrived now, imagine that world, already heavy with the smells of waste and rot, suddenly hit by the Black Death. Doctors of the 14th century didn't know what caused plague, but they were certain they could smell it. The air was corrupted, they said, filled with deadly miasma. The end of the line, by the 19th century, the institution of eunuchs was fading. Modernity, medicine, and moral reform all took their toll. In China, the last imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, lived well into the 20th century. He served the last emperor, Puyi. Yes, the one from the Last Emperor film, and outlived the dynasty itself. A lonely profession. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A place of cold stone, candlelight, and the faint, ever-present smell of wet straw and despair. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pull the blanket up to your chin. Because tonight's story isn't about knights, or kings, or even peasants, really. It's about the people who stood somewhere in between, close enough to touch both power and misery. People who were necessary, but never welcome. People who did the jobs everyone demanded, but no one wanted to think about. We're talking about medieval executioners, and more specifically, what happened to them after they hung up their axes, or their ropes, or, in some cases, their disturbingly well-worn swords, because being an executioner in the Middle Ages wasn't a career you simply retired from. It was a life sentence, in more ways than one. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, executioners were complicated. They were essential to the justice system, but legally and socially they lived on the fringes. They weren't quite criminals, but they weren't free citizens either. Their job was to kill cleanly, publicly, and without fuss. That could mean hanging, beheading, burning, breaking on the wheel, or, for those living in more creative jurisdictions, boiling and quartering. Naturally, it wasn't a popular career choice, so in many cases, the role of executioner fell to people who didn't really have a choice at all. A common path into the job was, as punishment, a convicted criminal could be offered a pardon on one condition. They agreed to become the town hangman. You'd think that was a cruel joke, but it happened all over Europe. One day you're the condemned, and the next you're the one swinging the axe. And once you became one, it stuck. even if you served your sentence, even if you'd done your duty for decades, society rarely forgot. An executioner didn't simply walk away from that kind of reputation. So what did happen when they retired? That's the question that lingers. Because in a world obsessed with sin, purity, and divine justice, who forgave the hangman? To survive, they tried to fight bad air with good smells. People carried posies of flowers, burned aromatic woods, or held oranges stuffed with cloves under their noses. This was the origin of the posy. In the nursery rhyme, ring around the rosy, the idea that a pocket full of flowers could keep the sickness away. Of course, it didn't, but at least it made dying smell slightly nicer. Private odors. A world without privacy 1. Final note before we drift onward. The medieval sense of smell wasn't just about hygiene. It was about intimacy. Without modern plumbing, deodorant, or sealed walls, people lived constantly within each other's odors. You knew your neighbors by scent. You shared beds, clothes, and air. And while that might sound unpleasant, it also meant that smell carried deep social meaning. A perfumed courtier was powerful. A foul-smelling pilgrim was holy. A freshly washed peasant might be considered suspiciously idle. Smell wasn't just personal hygiene, it was identity. Let's drift over, now, to the next part of our journey, into the private chambers of medieval nobility. We'll explore what bathing looked like at court, how perfumes were made, and why some kings were so obsessed with scent they nearly bankrupted themselves chasing it. Because while peasants may have smelled of earth and animals, the upper classes smelled of something far stranger, and occasionally much worse. Let's drift over to Germany for a moment, because, as with many grimly efficient systems, the Germans had this profession down to an art. From the 14th to the 18th century, German executioners were part of a structured, hereditary class. They were called Scharfrichter, literally sharp judges, which sounds noble, until you realize it meant the guy with the sword who ends you. Many of these men passed their trade down through generations. Sons inherited not only their father's tools, the sword, the leather apron, the special hood, but also his social stigma. And that stigma was serious. Executioners couldn't live inside city walls in many towns. They were banned from certain churches. People refused to eat with them, or even touch them, because they were believed to carry moral contamination, a sort of invisible miasma of sin. Even if the executioner was kind, honest, or surprisingly hygienic, it didn't matter. He was marked. So, when a Scharfrichter grew too old to swing the blade, his options were limited. There were no pensions for public decapitators. Retirement, if you can call it that, usually meant retreating to a small cottage on the edge of town, living off odd jobs, herbal remedies, and the occasional pig slaughter. Because, ironically, executioners were often skilled butchers, They had to know anatomy. After all, you can't just guess where the spine is and hope for the best. There's a grim irony here. Many executioners became healers. Yes, really. It turns out that people who spend their lives cutting into the human body sometimes become quite knowledgeable about it. So executioners often doubled as unofficial doctors, treating wounds, setting bones, brewing medicinal herbs. It was a strange balance. The same hands that took lives by morning could be mending them by afternoon. There's a documented case of an executioner in 17th century Nuremberg who became so respected as a healer that wealthy citizens came secretly to his door at night for treatment. They wanted his medicine, but not his reputation, so they wore hoods, because nothing says social respectability like creeping into a hangman's hut at midnight with a rash you don't want your priest to know about. Now, if you're imagining these retired executioners living quiet, peaceful lives in the countryside, not quite. Their families were often just as ostracized. Children of executioners couldn't attend regular schools. They married only within other executioner families, or among knackers, people who disposed of dead animals. It was an underclass of necessary uncleanliness, and even if they moved to another town, people usually found out, because their trade wasn't exactly subtle. Carrying around a two-handed sword with notches on the blade tends to draw attention, so many of them tried to reinvent themselves. They became surgeons, butchers, or traveling bone setters. Some ran taverns, though even then, customers drank nervously, unsure whether their ale had been poured by someone who'd once poured boiling oil over a heretic. Let's drift now to France. In Paris, the position of executioner became semi-official, even prestigious, at least in a bureaucratic sense. The Sanson family, for example, held the title for over 6 generations, from the 1600s to the French Revolution. They were practically an institution, but prestige didn't mean popularity. Even the most famous executioner in Paris, Charles-Henri Sanson, who personally executed Louis XVI, was still socially radioactive, lived in comfort but isolation. His descendants struggled to marry outside the family, and after his retirement, he kept meticulous records of his executions, thousands of names, dates, methods, a diary of death that he apparently reread in his old age. Because what else do you do when your entire life's work was making sure people stopped breathing efficiently? It's said that he became pious in his final years, attending church quietly at the back, always hat in hand, never sitting down. Habits die hard, especially if you've spent your life enforcing that principle. There's a melancholy thread running through all of this. Executioners lived at the edge of morality. They were servants of justice, yet branded with shame. They performed acts ordered by kings and courts, but the kings dined, and they dined alone. It's almost poetic. a necessary evil that society refused to embrace, even as it demanded their services, and when retirement came, when the hands trembled too much to tie a noose or aim a sword, there was no applause, no pension, no gratitude, no thank you for your service, just quiet disappearance. A small house, a fading reputation, and maybe a few loyal patients who swore by the hangman's ointment. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into that twilight world. We'll look at the executioner, families who tried to escape their pasts, and those who turned their infamy into something disturbingly close to nobility. Because, believe it or not, a few executioners did retire comfortably. They just had to get a little creative with the truth. So, take a slow breath, and when you're ready, we'll continue. Perhaps his wife asked how work went. Perhaps he said, routine day, 2 thieves, 1 confession, and then he'd sleep, because tomorrow there might be another thief, another confession, another routine day. Life went on quietly, in the shadow of the gallows. Let's drift now a little deeper into that shadow, into part 2, where we'll wander through the secret life of the executioner's family. The wives who married into infamy, the children who tried to escape it, and the small, strange rituals that kept death's household running. Because in a world obsessed with purity and sin, few people lived as close to both as the hangman's family. Take a slow breath. In the next part, we'll drift into the gilded decay of the 19th century, where the courtesans of Paris became celebrities. The lines between love and economics vanished, and the richest women in Europe weren't princesses, but professional mistresses. What did medieval monks do when they got bored? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time of candles, cloisters, and long stretches of silence. The Middle Ages. So, if you're lying in bed, maybe with the faint glow of your phone warming your face, and wondering what people did before Netflix, this one's for you, because tonight we're talking about boredom. More specifically, the very particular flavor of boredom reserved for medieval monks, men who took vows of silence, isolation, and poverty, and then had to fill roughly 16 hours a day doing, well, not much at all. So, dim the lights, take a breath, and let's drift quietly into the echoing stone halls of a medieval monastery, where the most scandalous event of the week was a new kind of porridge. The first thing to understand is that a monk's day wasn't exactly free-flowing. If you've ever had a job with a micromanaging boss, imagine that. But the boss is God, and he's always watching. The monastic schedule was called the Divine Office, and it divided each day into precise chunks of prayer, work, and reading. The monks woke before dawn, when it was still dark and cold enough to see your breath, and shuffled off to chant psalms in unison. They did this at least 7 times a day. which sounds fine, until you realize that meant getting up again around 2 a.m. for something charmingly called matins. And yes, it was as miserable as it sounds. But after prayer, there was work. Copying manuscripts, tending gardens, brewing ale, and pretending not to hate Brother Thomas. Yet despite all that, the human brain has a knack for getting restless, especially when your entertainment options are limited to pray, read Latin, or stare at wall. Naturally, monks got bored, very bored, and boredom, as it turns out, was a theological issue. The church even had a word for it, acedia, sometimes called the noonday demon. It was the kind of soul-crushing listlessness that hit around lunchtime, when you'd already prayed 6 times, weeded the abbey garden, and there were still another 8 hours until bed. Acedia wasn't just considered laziness, it was a sin. So, if you were bored, you were technically offending God. Imagine being both tired and guilty for being tired, a spiritual 2-for-1 deal. Still, monks being human, they found creative ways to handle it. Some leaned heavily into illumination, art, the kind of decorative doodles that turned simple Bible manuscripts into fever, dreams of gold leaf and tiny dragons. If you've ever seen a medieval manuscript with a marginal doodle of a snail fighting a knight, that's boredom at work. That's centuries of pent-up mischief leaking out through quill and ink. One monk, perhaps after a particularly long fast, drew a rabbit jousting with a dog. Another sketched a monk mooning a bishop. To be fair, he probably thought no one would ever see it. And yet, here we are, 700 years later, studying it under museum glass. A few monks took their restlessness outdoors. Gardening was technically part of the rule, the guidelines by which monastic life ran, but it also became a kind of therapeutic escape. Tending. Herbs or vegetables gave you an excuse to be outside, to listen to the wind instead of chanting psalms for the 100th time. There's even evidence that some monasteries got very into brewing beer. This was partly for hygiene. Water was questionable, but also, let's be honest, it helped pass the time. Beer was considered liquid bread, and monks rationalized it beautifully. You could drink during Lent, because it wasn't technically food, a miracle loophole if there ever was one. Of course, not all monks were equal. Some were deeply pious. Others were in it for the free meals. Medieval monasteries were massive institutions, some rich, some poor, and many doubled as schools, hospitals, or even inns for travelers. The Benedictines, for instance, became so wealthy from donations that they started living suspiciously well. When your vow of poverty includes 3 courses of roasted meats and imported wine, people start asking questions. Naturally, reformers tried to fix this. They created stricter orders, like the Cistercians, who emphasized simplicity, fasting, and manual labor. They built their monasteries in desolate areas to avoid temptation, which sounds noble, until you realize that they spent decades draining swamps and digging ditches, all while telling each other this was spiritual growth. And yet, even they got bored. One 12th century abbot complained that his monks spent too much time carving elaborate patterns into their tools, little spirals and crosses on every handle. The abbot called it a distraction from divine focus, modern. Historians call it creativity barely holding it together. Now, let's talk about the real enemy of the medieval monk: time. There was a lot of it, and the slower you tried to live, the slower it seemed to pass. To kill that endless ticking, monks invented routines, rituals within rituals. Copying books wasn't just about preserving scripture. It was an exercise in patience. You had to grind pigments, cut quills, stretch parchment, and write in flawless Latin for hours. If you made one mistake, one ink blot or slip of the hand, you couldn't erase it. You had to start the entire page over. Imagine doing that after lunch, when your eyes are drooping and your stomach's full of barley stew, and you're not even writing something thrilling. It's Leviticus again. Naturally, this led to some delightful margin notes. Monks would quietly vent their frustrations in the corners of the text, knowing no one but another scribe might ever read it. Some of these survive today, and they're surprisingly relatable. One monk wrote, "I am so very tired." Another wrote, "Oh, my hand," and my personal favorite, "Now I've written the whole thing. Give me a drink." The Middle Ages were grim, but at least the monks had the right priorities. Let's drift a little further into the communal life of the monastery. Contrary to what movies suggest, monks weren't completely silent all the time. They observed greater silence at certain hours, usually overnight, but otherwise could whisper during work or use gestures. Some developed intricate hand sign languages for daily communication. For example, a gesture for bread, another for cheese, another for wine, which tells you a lot about their priorities. There were even specific signs for bring the book, go to bed, and stop talking. That last one was probably the most popular. Monks were also human enough to have favorites and enemies. Records. From abbeys mentioned squabbles over everything from food, portions, to who got the good candle during scribing. One monk in York, Abbey wrote a complaint about Brother Stephen, who eats too much at supper and snores like thunder. Another chronicler simply noted, "A quarrel arose at dinner. I was not involved," which is monk speak, for I absolutely was involved. Music was another outlet for restlessness. Chanting wasn't entertainment exactly, but it filled the space between prayers with rhythm and harmony. Gregorian chants were designed to be hypnotic, the same melodic pattern repeating endlessly until you weren't sure whether you were singing or just existing. It's no coincidence that modern sleep playlists use them. Some monasteries became so skilled at polyphonics, singing multiple harmonies at once, that the church had to step in and remind them not to sound too good. The fear was that complex music might distract from God, because naturally, if you're having any fun, it must be sinful. And then there were books, the monk's most loyal companion. Reading was often done aloud, in a low, steady tone. This was called Lectio Divina, divine reading. It wasn't about learning new things, but meditating on familiar ones. Imagine spending an afternoon rereading the same 3 paragraphs of St. Augustine until you achieve enlightenment. Or, more likely, fall asleep. In some ways, that's exactly what they wanted. The goal was peace through monotony. Repetition wasn't dull. It was sacred. A modern equivalent might be listening to a 12-hour ambient rain playlist. It's not exciting. That's the point. Every now and then, though, something did happen. Maybe a relic arrived. A saint's bone, or at least someone's bone that looked convincingly old. The monks would process it through town, ring bells, and then go back to silence. Sometimes an important visitor would come, a bishop, a nobleman, or a very confused traveler who'd mistaken the monastery for an inn. The monks would feed him, offer wine, and listen politely while he complained about taxes. Then, as soon as he left, they'd write down every word in the chronicle. That's how we know so much about medieval life, because bored monks wrote everything down. They recorded eclipses, plagues, strange omens, local gossip, and the occasional flying pig sighting. It was part diary, part weather report, part small-town newsletter. In short, boredom built the historical record. But perhaps the strangest form of monastic boredom relief was wandering. Some monks simply couldn't take the routine anymore. They ran away. The church called them gyrovagues, or wandering monks. They drifted from abbey to abbey, claiming spiritual inspiration while mostly looking for better food. Church councils eventually banned the practice, calling them a plague upon the monasteries, which is harsh, but understandable if you've ever had an uninvited guest who won't leave. By the late Middle Ages, some became universities, others turned into local power centers, and a few, particularly in France, became almost indistinguishable from noble courts. The abbot might own land, host banquets, and wear silk robes for special occasions. You can imagine how spiritual that felt to the guy copying psalms in the cold. How did people smell in the 18th century? Hey everyone, tonight We're drifting into a world of powdered wigs, candlelight, and questionable hygiene. A time when perfume wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a survival strategy. So, get comfortable. Maybe light a candle, though hopefully not one made of tallow, and let's float gently through the fragrant and not so fragrant corners of the 18th century. Because tonight we're answering the question, how did people smell before soap, plumbing, and deodorant? Short answer, not great. Long answer, well, it depends who you were and what you could afford to cover it up with. To start, we should make one thing clear. People didn't think of clean the same way we do. Today, we're obsessed with freshness. Everything must smell like mountain breeze or alpine meadow. In the 18th century, the mountain breeze was mostly manure, and nobody thought that was strange. Bathing, in the sense of immersing yourself in water on purpose, was viewed with deep suspicion. Doctors warned it could open the pores and let in disease. So, most people avoided it unless absolutely necessary, or unless they'd fallen into a river. The preferred alternative was the dry bath, otherwise known as wiping yourself down with linen, scented vinegar, or a small sense of optimism. In aristocratic circles, this minimalist approach to hygiene was combined with maximum use of perfume. The idea wasn't to eliminate odor, it was to outcompete it. Imagine the smell of a crowded ballroom in Paris, circa 1770. Under all that powdered hair and silk lace was a rich blend of sweat, perfume, candle smoke, and desperation. Perfumes were floral, musky, or sometimes animal-based. That's not a metaphor. They literally contained things like civet, from cat glands, ambergris, from whale intestines, and musk, from deer glands. So, the next time you buy vintage musk, just remember, it's historically accurate. But not everyone had access to such luxuries. The working classes, especially in cities like London or Paris, lived surrounded by smells, from open sewers, tanneries, and rotting waste. The Thames River itself was known for its fragrance. Contemporary writers said it smelled like 1,000 open graves, which, given the sanitation, might not have been an exaggeration. People did what they could, carrying pomanders, little scented balls, burning herbs, or stuffing flowers in their sleeves. Some simply gave up and embraced the background aroma of existence. One French servant reportedly said, "We all stink, therefore we are equal." A surprisingly democratic sentiment. Let's drift for a moment into the bathroom situation, which for most people, didn't actually involve a room. There were chamber pots, which had to be emptied daily, often out the window. Hence, the famous cry of "Garde l'eau," or "Watch out for the water," which wasn't water. Imagine walking under an 18th century balcony on a summer day. Every step was a gamble. No wonder shoes had thick soles. The rich had servants for this unpleasant task. Of course, the poor just had better reflexes. Now, the hair situation deserves its own paragraph, or maybe a full sermon. Those towering powdered wigs were not washed. They were maintained like museum exhibits, brushed, dusted, and occasionally fumigated. The powder itself, made of starch and scented oils, attracted a variety of small tenants. Lice were common, but also tolerated. People simply scratched politely, or hired nitpickers, literal professionals who combed out infestations. When wigs began to smell too strongly, they were refreshed with lavender water or, in desperate cases, repowdered and ignored. Essentially, dry shampoo. If your shampoo were flour. Underneath, natural hair was cropped short or shaved entirely, so the scalp could breathe, or at least try to, under half a pound of perfumed starch. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants followed a simpler regimen. Wash your hands, face, and feet when you can, and hope it rains. Water wasn't always clean, and bathing in it was seen as risky. You might get miasma, bad air, and that was thought to cause disease. So instead, they focused on clean linens. Changing your shirt was considered as good as taking a bath. It symbolized freshness, even if the rest of you was historical. When travelers stopped at inns, they often shared beds, not just with friends, but with strangers. This wasn't considered scandalous. It was practical. And if your bedfellow smelled strongly of goat, that was simply part of the adventure. Let's drift back to the aristocracy, the true pioneers of olfactory denial. At Versailles, the palace was stunning, but hygiene was optional. There were almost no bathrooms, and people relieved themselves wherever was convenient. Behind curtains, under staircases, in decorative vases. Visitors often commented on the smell. Even the palace gardens, so perfectly symmetrical, were watered with less than pure substances. And yet, this was the height of civilization. Louis XIV, the Sun King, reportedly bathed only a few times in his life, and only on doctor's orders. He believed that too much bathing could weaken the body. Instead, He had servants rub him down with linen and rose water, and he wore so much perfume that courtiers fainted. Not metaphorically, they actually passed out. Naturally, when your king smells like a perfumed volcano, everyone else follows suit. Perfume sales boomed. Hygiene remained theoretical. It's easy to laugh, but to be fair, they were working with the science they had. Miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad smells, encouraged people to mask odors rather than remove their sources. So long as your nose was full of roses, you were safe. Doctors prescribed aromatic treatments for almost everything. Lavender for nerves, vinegar for fainting, and camphor for moral decay. If you caught a cold, you might sniff a clove-studded orange. If that didn't work, you could always blame the air and move to the countryside. Speaking of the countryside, let's visit a bathhouse. Public bathhouses had largely disappeared by the 18th century in Western Europe, blamed for spreading immorality and, inconveniently, syphilis. But in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, they survived. In Russia, steam baths, banyas, were wildly popular. People would sweat, beat themselves gently with birch branches, and then roll in the snow. The French thought this was barbaric. The Russians thought the French smelled like perfume-covered corpses. Both were correct. Perfume itself became a complex art. The wealthy had their own personal perfumers, people who could blend custom scents to match personality, mood, or scandal. Catherine the Great of Russia preferred floral blends with amber and musk. Marie Antoinette liked orange blossom and jasmine, and others, like the Comte de Saint-Germain, apparently smelled like a scented candle shop exploded. Perfume wasn't just for skin. It was for gloves, letters, wigs, furniture, even pets. Small dogs were perfumed and powdered to match their owners, which must have been adorable, until it rained. And yet, not everyone was unwashed. By the late 18th century, attitudes began to change. Enlightenment thinkers, ever the killjoys, started, suggesting that maybe water wasn't evil. They noticed that people who bathed occasionally didn't immediately die. Doctors like Samuel Auguste Tissot began recommending warm baths for cleanliness and morale, which was radical, given that morale was usually treated with opium or denial. In cities, private bathrooms started appearing among the elite, complete with pumps, porcelain tubs, and sometimes even running water. It was considered decadent, a luxury reserved for philosophers and people with strong plumbing. But by the time the 19th century rolled around, Cleanliness was beginning to replace perfume as the sign of refinement. The new motto became, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," which must have horrified Louis XIV's ghost. Still, the 18th century's signature scent lingered. A complex blend of roses, sweat, vinegar, tallow candles, and ambition. When you picture a lady in powdered hair, imagine the cloud of starch and jasmine surrounding her. When you think of an 18th century gentleman bowing, imagine the faint creak of leather shoes and the musk of 3-week-old linen. It's oddly humanizing, isn't it? They conquered continents, wrote symphonies, and founded empires, all while smelling like slightly decorative goats, and yet they believed they were beautiful. And perhaps they were, in a way that required distance. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, if history had a smell, the 18th century would be unforgettable. Not pleasant, but unforgettable.